Hello and welcome to episode 197 of the Book Binge for something a little bit different than I had originally planned. Today's video was originally planned to be a discussion with DJ Butler about the book Witchy Eye, which I just reviewed on Tuesday, so that would have made a little bit of sense for to have those come basically back to back. However, he wanted to finish up some writing, get out of the little writing snap he was in at the time, which is totally fair. But as a result, the scheduling of that video is delayed until a time that I don't really have set right now. So today's video is instead going to be something a little bit more topical. Let's discuss some books that changed my life to some degree. Now, I will admit, very first thing before we jump into like the whole stack of books that I have over here is that not every one of these books would normally get the distinction of this book changed my life. This is more a list of books that really heavily impacted me, or books that I'm grateful or thankful to have for one reason or another, either because of the way they impacted me, how strongly they impacted me, or because of something they did for my reading life or expanded my horizons in some way, something notable enough that I felt like it was worthy of actually sharing. There are quite a few books here. All of them had some manner of lasting impact on me that I felt was notable for the video, so let's kind of just jump into it. There are going to be 4 eras that I discuss these in. There's going to be the beginner era, so a few of the books that I remember from very early in my reading journey when I first learned to read when I started school in about 3rd grade. If you want to know a little bit more about that journey specifically, I have another story time video from a couple of years back when I talked about learning to read. There will be the middle school era, which will be some of the most impactful books that I read in basically just middle school, maybe even a couple books in junior high school. But by the time you get to junior high school and high school, we have the YA/slump era, so some of the books that I really enjoyed in that time, despite not really reading very much from like the years of 8th grade through like 2021, late 2021, so about a year and a half after I graduated high school. That whole 5-6 year span, somewhere in there, was a time where I just didn't really read anything, or only read a few books in very short bursts every once in a while, like during the summertime at camp or something along those lines. And then we'll have at the very end a 4th era called the Booktube Era, which will be some of the most impactful books that I've read so far, just having this Booktube channel. So the 3 years just about that I've been doing this. Is that right? 22, 23, 24? Yeah, 3 years or so that I've been doing Booktube. Without further ado, I'm not going to delay this any longer because there's quite a few books to discuss here. Let's start with the beginner era. Now, the first book here, I don't actually have to show off because I have no idea where in my house it is located, if we even still have it. It is the first book that I remember loving, and that is Dr. Seuss's Green Eggs and Ham, which is kind of a weird pick, but when I was first learning to read, Dr. Seuss was obviously one of the ones that you kind of learned to read with. Green Eggs and Ham was actually one that my mother, back when she was a kid, she memorized it, had it memorized. She could spout it from memory just as a small kid. It was one of the first books that she learned to read in that way. It was kind of a similar story with me. It was probably the first book that I read through all the way by myself, and was also one that I had memorized. I would kind of just go through it all of the time. I was an annoying autistic little kid, and Green Eggs and Ham was the special interest for a solid period of time. So I kind of have to mention that book because it was one of the most important books in my reading journey, and just so far as like, oh, he got obsessed with that, he memorized that. Yeah, that was pretty impactful, we can say. Next book that we're going to go on here was, I believe, maybe the first book that I was ever gifted. At least it's the first one that I remember being gifted. I believe it was for my 8th birthday, maybe 7th birthday or something like that. Uncle Wiggily's Storybook by Howard R. Garris. I don't think I've ever actually read this through all the way. I think my mom used to read a couple of the stories from this just out loud to the family in the evenings sometimes when I was a kid. I don't remember how many of the stories we got through. I know we read a couple. I still have a couple of these stories kind of imprinted in my mind, specifically one associated with losing teeth. If I'm not mistaken, yeah, Uncle Wiggily's Toothache, so the very first story in the collection, I definitely remember very strongly. We definitely didn't read all of these. I have not read this whole book in totality, but just the fact that it's kind of been on my shelf for basically as long as I could remember, is one of the very first books I ever owned, I kind of had to mention this one. And you could probably have noticed in past videos up to this point, it is actually visible on the shelf back here, but just barely. Next up, we're going to talk about a small series of books that I'm going to stick up here as a picture. These are, I think, the Eyewitness book series back in elementary school. I feel like this was the book series, like just a bunch of these types of old nonfiction books that my elementary school had when I was going there. I might actually be wrong about the distinction of which series it was. I just remember there being a lot of large size nonfiction books that I read in like 4th grade. That was a lot of what developed my interest in ancient history and stuff along those lines, kind of an older era of nonfiction storytelling. Still telling things in a way that young kids would be kind of interested in, with illustrations and pictures on the inside. I don't remember what those books were. Doing some Google searches, I was able to determine it might have been the Eyewitness books, but I actually have no idea for sure, so I'm going to kind of include that tentatively, but I felt like it was important to notate because that was a large part of why I do like certain nonfiction, or why I'm not turned off to nonfiction entirely. Next up is going to be the first major book series that I ever fell in love with, the first series I fell in love with to really any degree that I would call an obsession. That was the 39 Clues. This was one of the ones that when I was learning to read and I was starting to get into that actual, like, oh, you can read chapter book type stuff now rather than just all the, learning to read things that I was reading back in 3rd grade when I was starting to learn and actually going to school. This was the series in 4th grade that my mom introduced me to by taking me to the library. It was just like, oh, this is a series that I'm pretty sure you would like, and she was right. Rick Riordan, of course, wrote the very first one of these, which we'll talk about Riordan here in a bit. Spoiler alert, 39 Clues was a very impactful series because, well, I fell in love with it. I still remember when this whole series back here, that's the first series, and that's the sequel series right there. I still remember when these books were like huge to me, when this one being 220 pages was on the longer side for books that I had read. Now it's just absolutely tiny. I could read this in a day if I wanted to now. So it's pretty crazy thinking back on this, but some of my earliest memories with reading are with this book specifically, but with the 39 Clues in general. I just absolutely love this series and was a very big part of my reading development, that is for sure. And thus ends the beginner era for this video. And now we move into the middle grade era, as I called it, which is basically some of the stuff that I read throughout middle school, basically. We'll say end of elementary school, but that's kind of what 39 Clues was my obsession in 4th grade. Moving into middle school with like 5th through 6th grade-ish, somewhere in that time period. Some of these books are some of the ones that had the bigger impact on me at the time. There's no specific order to when I experienced these, just some of the ones that had the biggest impact. The first one, of course, is going to be The Wrath of Darth Maul by Ryder Wyndham, which is one of the very first books that I reviewed on the channel. I believe it was my 3rd book review. The 5th episode of the Book Binge was on The Wrath of Darth Maul, and still one of my most viewed book reviews on the channel up to this point, surprisingly enough. I absolutely love this book. If you want to hear my thoughts on that, go check out the review. But this one was definitely huge for me as a big Star Wars fan. I wanted to be able to read Star Wars books, but felt like all the normal Legends stuff was kind of a little bit too big, and I think way too mature for me at the time, and this was something way more approachable, being not very many words per page, pretty short relatively speaking, which is actually the book's biggest weakness. I wanted it to be like 3 times longer, but it is a book that I fell in love with and I've read many times. And if you were to ask me one of the reasons why Star Wars is one of my favorite things, this book is actually a not small part of it. Darth Maul is maybe my favorite Sith, and this book is, again, a not small part of it. Also really influenced the way that I think about the writing and the reading of villains in stories. This book definitely had an influence on that. Next up will be a book that very many of you will recognize, and that is The Hobbit from The Lord of the Rings, or the precursor to The Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien. This book I really like. I reread it a few years back and loved it even more than I did the first time. And the first time I read it was in 6th grade. This was the first epic fantasy I'd read, the first real fantasy book I had read in general. I mean, I had read a couple of Ranger's Apprentice books in 5th grade, and that kind of had some of that vibe going for it, but I'd only really been able to get through a couple of those books at that point in time. The Hobbit was definitely the thing that made me decide that I liked fantasy kind of in general in a literary format, and I read this, I'm pretty sure, because of the movies existing. So say what you will about the Hobbit movies, which I don't really have anything to say about them at this point because I need to rewatch them to know for sure how I feel. But the Hobbit as a book was definitely great, and the fact that the movies got me to read the book in 6th grade was a big thing. Tolkien has had an influence on my life to some degree, not as big as most other people, or at least most other fantasy fans in general, but The Hobbit was definitely up there for me in 6th grade. It was like the biggest challenge of a book I had read by that point in time, not necessarily because of its length, even though it's 300 pages. It's not that long, but like the chapters in it are long. For example, the very first chapter is, oh, I don't know, like 27 pages or something like that. Yeah, just about 27, 30 pages. For my reading level at that point in 6th grade, that was pretty lengthy. That was a lot, so it was a bit of a challenge for me, and I'm grateful that I took that hurdle here because it got me into reading stuff that was generally a little bit more ambitious in the first place at that period in my life. And something that you could kind of say the same thing about is more Rick Riordan stuff. Percy Jackson and the Olympians, Heroes of Olympus, a couple of my favorite book series. These were definitely a huge impact on my reading journey. In fact, the reason that I wanted to be an author for so long, and still do, obviously, I work on my own writing stuff periodically as I'm able to this day, but the reason, the initial spark for that desire came because of Riordan, because of these books. And there's really not much else that I have to say about them. If you want to hear my thoughts about these two series and specifics and some other Rick Riordan stuff, I have reviews for both of the series as well as the King Chronicles and stuff like that on the channel, so you can check those out. Next up is another book that I have read many times, kind of like The Wrath of Darth Maul, and has become a long-time favorite that I've also reviewed on the channel and talked about in another Storytime video, which was a video discussing the month of April as kind of a reading nostalgia month for me, a month that I have a lot of memories tied to as far as reading goes. The Card Turner was a big part of that. The Card Turner was a book that I read over spring break or in the springtime. I read at least once a year, probably for 6 or 7 years in a row. This book is easily one of my most favorite books in the world, and to explain why it really impacted me or why it has had such a lasting impact is kind of hard because I don't really have like an explicit reason why this changed my life. It's part of the reason why I had to explain the title at the beginning being something that was like, is more books that just had a lasting impact on me rather than like substantially shifted my view on anything. This, I don't think, really changed my life to any degree, besides just the fact that a book about something that could seem so stupid or boring, such as the card game Bridge, which is what this is about, is something that can actually be really, really well done. Maybe that kind of changed my perspective on reading in general to a small degree, but other than that, I don't really have a reason to explain why this specifically has had such an impact on me, but it is definitely one of my favorite books, and one that I'll hold on to for the rest of my life, and will probably reread many more times into the future. If I had ever actually decided to learn how to play the game Bridge, I probably would be able to have that reason, be like, yeah, I learned Bridge because of this, but up to this point, I still haven't done that. I don't know if I ever will, but every single time I read the book or think about it, I wonder why I haven't actually given Bridge a shot yet. Next up, we are now moving into the YA/slump era, where I was kind of getting into, it wasn't even really middle school anymore. This was more like the junior high school era, 7th and 8th grade, basically. Some of the books that had an impact on me during that time, and then that was more like the YA stuff, and then the slump era was like, the whole era throughout high school where I wasn't really reading anything. There's one book that I wanted to talk about in that specific port, but obviously didn't want to include in its own little section, so we're just going to kind of move here and start off with a little duology of books, which is going to aggravate many people. This is book 1, this is book 2 of a little duology. The fact that they don't match the sizes in here is really, really aggravating, but Phoenix Island and Devil's Pocket are some favorite books of mine. I would say if they affected my life to a notable degree, it was kind of how I perceive the balance of power, how I perceive wielding power as a person, because the main character, the main journey that he takes in these books is learning how to wield power. He is punished for beating people up, but not because he's a bully, but because he's protecting other people from bullies, and he's the one that takes the fall for it. That is kind of what instigates him being sent to Phoenix Island as a sort of rehabilitation facility. If you could even call it that. There's a lot of interesting stuff going on with these two books, and a lot of what impacted me was just kind of the way that I view the power dynamic between especially like younger people who are still considered like young adults. That this was really impactful on me for that reason. To go any further and explain any deeper would be to spoil a lot of things. It also actually piqued my interest about some other books that I have read or tried to read. One of the books that I tried to read in 8th grade when I was probably a little bit too young for it at the time, or maybe it was more like 9th grade. I don't remember for sure. Maybe 10th grade. I've reread these books a few times as well, so I don't remember where specifically it happened, but like Dante's Inferno is mentioned in, I believe, Devil's Pocket, and this kind of takes inspiration to some small degree from the Inferno, or at least Dante's vision of hell. And that got me interested in reading Inferno, which I did read back in like 10th grade, I think it was, but I don't remember basically anything from it. I didn't really understand it very much, but these have influenced my life. I can say that is definitely something that happened, but they're an underknown, definitely a series that not many people know about, that I wish they did, because I think if more people my age when I read those books read them, would absolutely love them for sure. Next up is a book that really changed my mindset on assigned reading as an idea, because, you know, everybody kind of goes through school, they hate reading, they hate being assigned books that they don't really want to read. And for some kids love reading, but then grow to hate it because of assigned reading in school. Some kids don't really like it, but come to like it because of assigned reading. That's a very small number of people, relatively speaking. And then you have people that enjoy reading but just don't enjoy being assigned reading from school. In 8th grade, however, my English teacher assigned us, my class, I Am Number 4 by Pittacus Lore to read. The reasons why I'm really not sure, actually, all things considered. Maybe because it's a more modern book, modern storytelling with characters that were actually our age at the time and that seemed relatable to some degree, especially since a large portion of this book, I think, takes place in a relatively rural town of Ohio, I think is where this one takes place. And I grew up in a rural town in Wyoming. Still live in Wyoming, so there's aspects to that that are relatable. This book completely changed my mindset on assigned reading, because of course we got assigned this and I'm like, I don't really want to read this, like what are we doing? But then the prologue is actually pretty good. Read the first few chapters over a few days, but then one night, I believe I was somewhere around chapter 4 or 5, and I started reading one night to do the assigned reading for the week, and this was back when I was having my bedtime because of family, the family system, will say, around 8:30 or so at night, usually. At least by 9 o'clock we had to be in bed. I was in bed, I believe, at 8:30 one time, and I was reading this before going to sleep, and the next thing I knew, it was 4 o'clock in the morning and I had finished the book. I spent right about 7.5 hours straight in bed that night. It was a Saturday night, I remember, because I slept all the way through church that Sunday morning, and my mom couldn't even wake me up. I was so dead tired because I stayed up so late reading the book, because I'd finished it. And the first time that I reread it, because I believe I've read this one 3 times. I know I've at least read it twice, but every time that I've read this, it was kind of the same thing. I get through the few chapters, or the first few chapters, one night, and then I basically finish the whole thing in a second or a third night and just plow through it. The way this impacted the way that I viewed assigned reading in school and stuff like that is actually quite large. That's primarily the way that it affected my life. It's not just the fact it's a favorite book, it's because of how it affected that. In fact, these next 3 books I'm going to show you didn't really change my life to any notable degree. I suppose you could say one of these sort of did, but The Great Gatsby, Fahrenheit 451, and Animal Farm are all books that I had to read for English in junior year of high school assigned reading that I actually quite enjoyed. In fact, there are some other things that we did through and there. We read the first play of Oedipus. That was really good. I enjoyed that. That same year we also did Julius Caesar and Hamlet by Shakespeare, but or kind of reading them, quote unquote, alongside with some film adaptations of them. So there was a lot of stuff that we did in English in junior year that I really enjoyed, that I enjoyed largely because of how much this book changed the way I viewed assigned reading moving into high school. So that is where that one is going to fall on the list, and that is why. And next up is a book that initially at the time is basically what kind of got me interested in certain aspects of science fiction or scientific concepts, even though that's a thing that I have enjoyed to some degree in my life. Space exploration and stuff like that has always been something that I've been interested in. The Martian is something that really took that off. Most of my other favorite books, or any of the other books that I've talked about on this list, aren't really sci-fi. I Am Number 4 has plenty of sci-fi stuff in there, but it's not sci-fi the way that this is. It's not, you look at that, it's just like, oh, that's a sci-fi book. I Am Number 4 is kind of, but there's also enough of it that is relevant enough to the real world that it also isn't. And then the Star Wars book is just Star Wars. You don't really call that sci-fi, it's just Star Wars. The Martian was definitely a book that I really loved in 8th grade, and to say it really had an impact on me is, you know, it's kind of like the card turner. It's hard to say why specifically it had an impact on me, but it did expand my horizons in some sense. It also taught me that you could have a lot of cursing in a book and have it not be out of place or not feel vulgar, but because Mark Watney is just a very human character in this book and happens to curse a lot, it also kind of had an impact because I loved it so much I had to watch the movie, and that movie is one of my favorite movies of all time. Something about The Martian just really works for me. That's part of why it's kind of an influence. This was one of the books that I read in, I believe, first time was freshman year of high school. It was one of those things that we had assigned reading that year, but we didn't have to read books that the teacher wanted. He let us pick the books that we wanted, and this was one that jumped out at me and, you know, kind of continued that shifting of how I viewed assigned reading and whatnot, kind of the way that I Am Number 4 did. Just kind of throw this in here because it's a great book, and because I feel like it had some measure of impact on me, even if I can't quite quantify it the way that I would like to. But last up is the book that takes place during the Slump Era, as I kind of referred to it at the beginning of this section, because throughout most of high school I didn't really read anything, and if I did, it was like a handful of books over the 1 week of camping that me and some of my family would do at some point during the summertime. Pieces of Paris happened to be one that I started, like, I don't remember if I started it before the camp trip or not, because I was reading a lot of stuff by actually somebody that I'm related to wrote, Claire Polson. Claire M. Polson has plenty of books, and I was enough into reading that I could read those. They're kind of thriller, pretty short, easy to read, really young, like maybe 3rd, 4th grade reading level type of easy to read. And we have some other books downstairs that kind of felt along that sort of thing. And Pieces of Paris was one that I picked up by Gigi Vandegrift. And this was, I believe, after sophomore year. It probably was. It might have been after junior year. I forget off the top of my head which one it was, but it was during a camping trip after one of those years, and this one punched me in the gut in some real big ways. To explain why is, again, kind of spoilery to the book, but things regarding a topic that I can't actually mention here on YouTube without probably getting in trouble, even though I'm like not monetized or anything like that. There's subject matter in here that felt way too relatable in the wake of a breakup that I had just had by that point in my life. It was relatable. There are too many aspects to the internal drama of Pieces of Paris and the way the story unfolds and the way that certain revelations happen that really messed me up. In fact, after coming home from camp that year, my mom like very much noticed, like, there's something wrong. What is wrong with you? And it was because I'd been so like just traumatized by this book to some degree, because it's not even just the fact that I was like going through a breakup. It was because I thought I was over the breakup. I was like, I don't really hurt when I think about this anymore. I'm not sad when I think about this anymore. I've kind of accepted that this is the way of life. Pieces of Paris told me, no, you're absolutely wrong. You still have some things to work through. And I was like, not ready for that. So just something about this book really hit and really hit for me in the right ways and frankly the right time in my life, because if I had read this any time before that, I don't know that I would have liked it or would have appreciated it for what it was doing. And anytime after I had actually completed that sort of cycle of my life, might not have had the effect that it needed to, or might have been too late to have that effect. I do really want to reread this book. I've been wanting to reread it for probably 2-3 years now, so that I can go back and kind of re-experience that from a more mature and actually healed perspective. Something about this just really hit for me, and is one that I again want to reread and want to be able to recommend to all of you guys if it still holds up, because yeah, this one was huge for me at one point in time. I don't think I'll ever look at this book without weirdly tinged, negatively tinged fond memories, if that makes any sense. But yeah, that was a big one for me. But finally, we move into what I am going to call now the Booktube era, some of the most impactful books on my reading journey since starting Booktube for one reason or another. The first one of these, of course, has to be The Lord of the Rings, which I read pretty early on in my journey when I started doing the Booktube thing. Stephen King was another author that I was starting to read pretty early, around the same time that I was reading Lord of the Rings, and I would have included Stephen King on here, but I couldn't find a way to really justify that. But some of Stephen King's early books and then this trilogy were a lot of what rekindled that love for reading. It wasn't just the fact that I had finally gotten back into reading after so many years of just not, back in September, October of 2021. It was the fact that I joined the Discord server for Mike's Book Reviews, another channel here on the platform. Many of you watching me probably know of him or have watched some of his videos. And yeah, this trilogy was going to be a read along that autumn in 2021. So I decided to join because, like I said, I was just coming back into reading again back in that period of time. And this trilogy felt like one that was just like, okay, well, if I'm going to read a bunch of the fantasy stuff that I want to read right now, I might as well get Lord of the Rings actually out of the way, because at that point I had read The Hobbit once or twice. I had tried and failed to read The Fellowship of the Ring, and then a couple years later finished Fellowship, and then also read The Two Towers very slowly over several months, but then never continued after that. So I was like, okay, this is my time to restart from the beginning and do the whole thing and actually get through it. And it was fantastic. I actually have reviews for these 3 books as well. They're very early videos on the channel and basically have no views. In fact, the Two Towers review might have like 11 views, but like 20 seconds of watch time, if that says anything about how far the channel has come since then. But these 3 are fantastic. I don't really need to explain why they had an impact, but more than just The Hobbit having an impact on me being interested in or liking the idea of fantasy, Lord of the Rings definitely solidified for me that I was a fantasy fan, and this was going to be a journey that I would love. And I've read plenty of fantasy and a ton of books since then, and frankly, it was pretty early in the booktube journey, and it was pretty impactful for that reason too. Next up is a book that I read for the monthly classics read along when it originated in Mike's server back in February of 2022. Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, which is an incredible book. I know not everybody loves it, but this is one that I adore. For some reason, it just clicked with me, and was actually a lot of what inspired me to do like in-depth written book reviews. That was the main impact it had on me. After reading it, I would go on tangents in my head for several days afterward, kind of like explaining to myself the impact and importance of several things in it. I actually tried to start a series on the channel called Count the Classics. There is a video of that series from Frankenstein, the only episode of that series to ever exist, which was a scripted book review sort of the book. And it was the very first and only scripted book review on the channel up until I reviewed a couple of other books that we're actually going to talk about on this in this video a little bit later. Frankenstein shifted kind of my perspective on analyzing books. Basically, it was an early book that kind of inspired that change. I intended for it to be a thing where I did a Count the Classics, a scripted review for all of the classics that I read, which is why I didn't review very many classics in my regular book review format for like a year afterwards. Maybe even longer than that, I don't remember for sure, but it took me a while. Frankenstein was a big part of that. It had a huge shift on my reading journey, and it reminded me that, like, yeah, old books aren't bad. Like, this was great, and it started me on a train of reading a ton of classics for another year and a half after that. I still read them every now and again, just not as regularly as I did for various reasons. Frankenstein started that journey. I absolutely loved that, and now I can say I have been writing very in-depth book reviews for basically every novel that I've read this year in 2024, and without Frankenstein kind of shifting my mindset and making me think that, like, yeah, I can write in-depth book reviews. I'm not sure how long it would have taken me to kind of come to that conclusion or that decision on my own. Next up is going to be not the thing that I'm grabbing over here, actually. Next up is going to be another thing that I'm going to show off here. This will be Another Kingdom, the trilogy by Andrew Clavin, which I wouldn't say this had a huge impact on my life because of the story that it had or the characters or anything like that, but because of the audiobook. Up to this point, I hadn't really done anything audiobook wise. I was pretty convinced that it wasn't going to be a thing for me, but I decided to give it a shot because the Another Kingdom trilogy happens to be free as an audio podcast. You can listen to those books, the audiobooks of them, on Daily Wire. If you happen to be a member, there's an audio tab and they happen to be there. I was like, sure, these three books exist here, I'll give them a shot. While I don't love absolutely everything about these books, and in fact the second book I found to be so forgettable I can conjure up like one scene from it and that is it, the third book is incredible, and the first book is quite a good introduction to that series, and frankly kind of the way that it made me think of audio, and Michael Knowles' narration of it is actually pretty great, all things considered. This series definitely changed my mind on audiobooks and made me willing to try some stuff that way. But next up is going to be, let's say, my first real successful journey with something that I would consider epic poetry. Now, you might consider certain plays of like Oedipus, maybe something along these lines, but I would argue that the Iliad and the Odyssey are the first like epic poems that I completed and really loved. I read these in September and October of 2022, and they're just fantastic. If you have not read Homer, you should read Homer, especially if you're into Greek mythology or ancient Greek history to any degree. These are an absolute must, and I had a blast reading them. Rest in peace to Peter Green, by the way. He just passed away, I believe, a couple of months ago at this point. The translator of the copies that I read and are amazing. These translations are great. Loved them, loved the story, loved being able to experience these to any degree. If you want to hear more of my thoughts on them, I have a review of these as well. I've reviewed most of the books that I've talked about so far in this video, I believe. But this was great and really kind of opened my eyes to the fact that, like, yeah, epic poetry, or, you know, poetry in general in the form of an epic story like this doesn't have to be a slog, and you don't have to think of it like poetry. Where something like the Divine Comedy I had tried several years ago, like I said, in high school, and I still want to get back to and actually read the full Divine Comedy here at some point soon, trademark. The Iliad and the Odyssey are what really opened my eyes to the fact that epic poetry doesn't have to feel like poems. Epic poetry can just be a story told in a different medium, and that's what made these awesome. It was absolutely amazing to be able to experience these. I actually want to reread them pretty soon at some point, but I won't have the time to be able to reread these, but I actually do plan to read the Aeneid at some point next year. I'll have another video talking about some of next year's reading plans coming in December. Stay tuned for that. But yeah, Iliad and the Odyssey had a huge impact on me that way. And if we're going to talk about that, I suppose I could have talked about Goodbye Eri being the first manga that I read and reviewed several months ago here on the channel. Goodbye Eri was my first manga and kind of made me open to the idea of reading the occasional manga story. I have since done 2 manga reviews, and I'm in the middle of another manga right now, but I didn't feel like it changed my life or anything like that to a degree that I felt justified in putting it in here, even though I could have. I very well could have. If I'd done this video a year from now, it probably would be in there because of the reason that we just stated. Next up, let's talk about a book that is absolutely one of my favorites, and that really, let's say this influenced my TBR for absolutely years. The full story, I believe, of why I was interested in reading Les Miserables by Victor Hugo several years ago is in a review for the book that I did back in, I don't remember when the review came out, but I read it in November of 2022. The very first day all the way through the very last day was exactly how long it took me to read this one singular book. and it was incredible. I love this book. Part of the reason why I would say it influenced my life is because of the fact that my family, my mother happened to own this version of it on the shelf below. I can remember way back even in 4th grade, back when I was only reading the 39 Clues of all things. Remember when I talked about that 30 minutes ago? Les Mis was always on my reading bucket list. I remember as far back as 4th grade, maybe even 3rd grade, not entirely sure, of like, oh yeah, I want to read that book. And well, I did finally in 2022, and it was incredible. So that's my justification for including this book on the list. If you want to hear more of my thoughts on that, I do have the review for it. This is definitely one of my favorites. I really enjoyed reading it, enjoyed reviewing it. Very, very great story in my opinion. Next up, we will talk about what is currently my favorite series in the world, and that is Sun Eater by Christopher Ruocchio. This is, of course, the lettered edition of Empire of Silence, the very first book in the series, the lettered edition of the Diamond edition. I don't know if I specified that. Sun Eater is incredible. If you want to know what I think about the series, there's a ton of videos on the channel for it. I'm not going to waste any more time discussing it here, but this series is awesome, and although I was pretty tentative about it with Empire of Silence overall, Howling Dark definitely changed my mind. Read everything in that series, and I've loved all of it, basically. Maybe only like 1 or 2 stories that I would say I don't absolutely adore, just in the totality of it. Ash is a Man, the 5th book of it, is essentially, for all intents and purposes, tied with Les Miserables as my favorite book ever. So to say that Sun Eater hasn't had a big effect on me, and then the 4th and 5th books entirely, if you've read them, you know exactly why they're absolutely destroying. And that 5th book destroyed me. It put me in a trauma, catatonic state of shock for like an hour after a specific chapter. If you know, you know. Kingdoms of Death had me crying several times, and although it's not that hard for a book to make me cry if I'm emotionally invested, it's not that hard for me to get emotionally invested, all things considered. Just the degree to which Sun Eater has impacted me is just something that I can't put into words. And then there's also the fact that I've actually worked a little bit on these books. I have not worked directly on Empire of Silence or this Diamond edition, but like if you own the ebooks for Tales of the Sun Eater volumes 2, 1 or 2 or 3, or the upcoming 4th one, if you happen to pick that up, I copy edited volume 3 and volume 4, and I helped to clean up the revised editions of those first 2. The copy of Dregs of Empire that you see up there, right there, and then all these special editions, at least that 3rd one, I proofread. This I happened to proofread. It took the same text from there, so that's something that I had an impact on as well. The revised edition of Queen of Midashes, which I don't own for some reason yet. I need to fix that. I helped revise that. Lesser Devil's going to come at some point next year. I helped to revise that. Basically all the upcoming Diamond edition and Antarida special editions I've had an impact on. The Murdered Sun, which is going to be an Antarida special edition, that was the original draft of Empire of Silence. I did a proofread for that. So like, there's work that I've done on the series. I know I rambled about that a little bit, I'm sorry, but it's not just that the books themselves had an impact on me, it's the fact that I've gotten to work on them to some degree and work with Christopher on some of these to some degree that has impacted my life and really helped me as far as writing goes on some of the technical details of some of the things that go into these projects. And like that's been huge for me. It's been great, and I'm very grateful for that. So Sun Eater's arguably had the biggest impact on me of any of these books because of that, but you know, I'm going to stop that there and stop rambling. Very last thing that I do want to talk about on the series or on the video is something that I kind of like a couple other books on the list can't really point to a specific reason why it impacted me or shifted my view on anything, but The Passenger and Stella Maris by Cormac McCarthy really touched me, and something about these was truly special. And something about them was so special that the reviews that I wrote for them were just too long to fit into Goodreads. In fact, I could only fit the introduction and conclusion of my review for The Passenger in Goodreads, so the entire body of it I just couldn't fit. What I decided to do with these 2 books was, instead of putting them on my website, which I will eventually when the website is a thing that exists again, that's why they're not over there, what I did was I recorded an audio version of these. And on my 2nd channel, I do music reviews, I do some gaming stuff, I do some scripted content on the 2nd channel. I didn't think that that kind of content would return to the main channel again, but these 2 books I reviewed that way. I recorded that script and made it a big review on the channel, and I'm very, very happy with that. These impacted me enough that I was like, yeah, the reviews are too long to fit on Goodreads, so let's just make them as long as I feel like they need to be, and then make them into a video essay on the channel. That is the kind of way these impacted my life, I guess. But to say why is hard to say without just spoiling the books or telling you to go watch that video, which that's good chunk of that is spoiler free, but most of it is spoiler filled. So, you know, take that risk if you want to. I just really love these books. I think they're great, and they really, really made a difference. I don't really know why specifically, but they did. These are ones that I definitely want to reread at some point in the future, and frankly can't wait for that, because I think it'll just be great. But now that we're like 40 minutes or something like that into this video, maybe like 35, 38 or something if we're lucky. Sorry for the long video, especially on Thanksgiving Day. I didn't think this would be as long as it ended up being, but that's just the way things go sometimes, you know? I know this was a lot of stuff. It was a long list of books, but I felt like pointing out some of the standouts, books that really had an impact on me throughout the years of my journey. Lucky I'm so young, because otherwise I would have picked a ton of books to make up for several more decades of reading. But, you know, feel free to shout out in the comments below some of the books that changed your life, some of the books that you're grateful for to some extent. If you happen to be in the US and today is Thanksgiving when you're watching it, I'm sorry I wasted your time today. Why aren't you spending time with your family or anything like that? But otherwise, I just wanted to make a video that was a little bit more topical to the holiday, for me at least. And I'd love to hear what some of your books are, some of your favorite books, some of the books that impacted you, whatever distinction you want to make. I look forward to hearing about some of those in the comments below. I know that art is very far reaching and affects different people differently. I want to hear some of the ones that have had the biggest impact on you, and I want to really give you a big thank you for watching this video in the first place. I know it was really long, kind of rambly. It was an idea that I just came up with kind of off the top of my head a couple days ago, trying to think of like, okay, what could I do on Thanksgiving that was Thanksgiving related in place of doing the discussion with Butler. So this was what I came up with. Thank you once again for watching. If you did, if you have anything you want to shout out in the comments below, I really would love to hear it. And thank you one last final time. I'll get out of your face now. Thank you for watching. I'll be back in the next video, whatever that may be, because I'm not entirely sure off the top of my head. It's going to be something this Sunday, but I forget what it is. But I hope to see you there, whatever it is.